Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. It is Monday, July 25th, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. Now, today I'm going to sit down with Landon Ross. He's an LA artist who infuses a lot of interesting science into his creations. But before we get started, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Now, remember, Talk Nerdy is 100% free to download for anyone who is interested. But if you want to help support the show, because it is listener supported, that's what pays my salary and keeps me going, producing, researching, and actually doing the interviews, posting them. I'm pre-production, I'm post-production, I'm the whole shebang. If you want to support the show that way, you can visit patreon.com/talknerdy and pledge your support. And if you're sick of hearing me say the same names at the beginning of the show every week, why don't you hear your name? All you got to do is pledge. All right, guys. This week I want to thank Phil T-Bear, Timothy Glover, Rod Adams, Charles Payette, Jafe, The Honorable Husband, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Ken Pfeiffer, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell for supporting the show. And thanks to all of you for listening each week. You really do, so much to make Talk Nerdy possible. If you guys have guest suggestions, if you have questions, if you, just want to know more, reach out to me at Cara Santa Maria on Twitter. That's where I'm most active, and say hi. All right, guys, without any further ado, here he is, Landon Ross. Well, Landon, thank you so much for joining me to Talk Nerdy today.
I'm thrilled to be here.
I am really excited because for those who don't know, you are a local artist here in Los Angeles, and you had, tell me if I'm wrong, was this your first sort of institutional show?
Yes, it was.
That's crazy to me. I don't know why I assume that you are just in galleries constantly.
No, this was my first, and I was super stressed about it and very excited about it. It was a new sort of angle to pursue, and I think it went really well.
Yeah, so I'm saying was, but it's still up, right?
Yes.
Your art's still up. How long? So here in Los Angeles, for anybody who's listening, Artifact is what the show is called, and it's is it pronounced LAX Art?
It's pronounced LAX Art. It has nothing to do with the airport. It's actually the way it's written is LA greater than sign, lesser than sign art. Oh. So it's the intersection that's what that logo is about. But so many times I have to answer to people, no, it's not at the airport.
Yeah. No, it's on Santa Monica.
It's up until August 20th officially, and then there will be some sort of closing programming that we'll do around September 6th or 7th, right after I get back from Burning Man.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you gotta push that off. But so last week, if I'm remembering correctly, was the open one night, and then you did this great event where you and Sean Carroll sat down and had a chat, partially about your work, partially about what inspired your work, and partially about Sean's work, because it was so sort of integral to yours. So why don't you, let's first start by talking about, I guess you could call it the flagship piece of the show, this blackboard that was inscribed with lots of Sean Carroll's physics.
Right. So the blackboard I consider to be the titular piece of the show, even though a lot of people think that Artifact meant the marble sculpture that was there or the devotional painting that was there. They're all working together, but the titular piece of the show is this blackboard that was built for that space. And then I installed it in Sean Carroll's office for 2 months, maybe a little more than 2 months, for his actual theoretical use. So, the instructions were, make this as authentic as possible. Mm-hmm. Do not think about the way that it looks or making your handwriting pretty. I want you to use this for your work with your students. I don't care if it says call Susan on Monday in the corner. It's really about just capturing that and having the characters be the image.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do with the piece was evoke. I wanted it to be a modern artifact, a wall of hieroglyphics, but one that told, or an origin story even, but one that told that story in a way that is more closely aligned with logic, reason, and truth than other origin stories that you may go to see, a wall of hieroglyphics at the Met. You don't know what the symbols mean, but it's very beautiful to look at, as is a blackboard. I've always thought that.
Yeah.
So the one fudge we did make was I told Sean he could not use a dry erase
Yeah.
because it's not as rich of a surface.
No, and with all of the crazy colors, I'm not sure if it would
The crazy
quite...
colors as well. With a blackboard, you can see the erased
Yeah.
equations underneath with all of the swirls of dust. And it's a really painterly thing. I love it.
And it really does evoke a sensibility of this academic language that so few people speak.
Exactly.
And that's what I love about it. Is that even as somebody who's trained in the sciences, like I can't fucking read any of that. Like there's some things I'd recognize, like, oh, that's a Feynman diagram. I know that because I've seen enough talks or I've read enough books, but I can't truly make sense of it.
Right.
I love that. And Sean even said that he had, some of the pieces or some of the, I guess, quote, scribbles on it were actual problems he was working out. Some of them were demonstrations or issues that he was working with his students on. And one of them was even an explanation to a child who came to visit him
Right,
at
that
his
was
lab.
the Feynman diagram.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, there are about 7 different fields that are on that board, some of which he actually published, I think, this month in Scientific Journal, so it's new work. Then there's work on the cosmological constant in the middle that he hasn't published or that he's just working out for himself. So there's a lot of different things on that board. But everyone's always asking about the pictorial elements like the tensor network or the Feynman diagram because it looks cool. It's like a little drawing.
And it's almost something that it is a hieroglyph in the sense of when you look at these formulas, they seemingly feel like a jumble of letters and numbers. It's a language that we don't speak. And when you see something pictorial, I think it really does have a neural trigger in it that is more emotive to people because then they start to try and overlay it with their own sensibilities.
Absolutely. And it's taken out of context as well. I mean, if you walked across this blackboard in a pedagogical setting, you wouldn't give it a second thought. You'd be like, okay, I'm at Caltech, there's a blackboard, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Right? But when you take the piece out and put it in a stark sort of white gallery space, you really notice how beautiful the characters are. And as I understand it, I think Hiero means sacred and glyph is the character. So while I don't necessarily like all the baggage that word has, that room is really meant to feel like a chapel that's exalting things that are not supernatural.
Yeah, and it had that vibe, especially because very close to it, you had this beautiful like triptych, like an altarpiece that looked like chapel doors that were open. But that also had, again, almost this trigger of a religious glimmer, but was absolutely secular in nature.
Yes, I mean that piece really moves me when I stand in front of it, and it's meant to move you in that feeling that you have when you're in a church in Rome, and you have this sort of. I don't know what word to use, but it's almost like you want to pray to it. But this piece that you're talking about is a devotional triptych. It's of exactly the same shape as those triptychs from medieval era and from the Renaissance, and it's meant to evoke that sort of religious imagery. But the surface is a completely pure element. So the centerpiece is bismuth, and the side panels are made of gold, and it's really about paying devotion to the underlying structure of the universe and its beauty, instead of some sort of mythical overlay, perhaps. And as well, like interestingly, I think using a lot of this show, I'm using materials that were only created in the last 3 seconds of a dying Type 2 supernova.
Nice.
So restricting the materials that way, and then you explain that to people, and they're like, "Wait, all of this was actually made in the last 3 seconds of a dying star?" Yes, it actually was. And that's moving to people.
Yeah.
And it should be experienced in that moving way, rather than just, actually, we were standing in front of the blackboard 2 weeks ago, about a week ago, and a curator asked me, which I found to be a very peculiar question, why didn't you just write an essay about this stuff? Why make art about it? And I was like, well, what a ridiculous question. Because obviously naturalism and nature and the underlying structure of the universe is equally valid as a discourse or as a subject matter for art as love or politics are.
Or religion.
Or religion.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you mention that you use the word naturalism. You and Sean use that word a lot when you had your discourse talking about the installation. And I noticed that, I don't know if I should say you shied away from it, but that you didn't actually use the term atheism when you were having the conversation. You really focused on using that term naturalism. And I was wondering if that was a calculated choice or if it's just that naturalism encompasses much more than atheism does.
It's not a calculated choice. I don't necessarily think that having a talk about atheism in a gallery when that's not really the subject is necessarily that useful, but naturalism is broader. Excuse me. But it's broader in a way that's not irritating like atheism plus, right? So it's about sort of the way you think and not necessarily what you think.
Gotcha. And not to say that like you or Sean or myself or probably many other people who were there viewing this conversation aren't aligned in that way with atheism, but that wasn't really the fundamental point of the exhibit.
This is much more of like a positive celebration rather than like some polemic on religion. That's not what my show is about. It's not. I think that would be very short-lived and boring as a subject.
Just kind of rejecting the values that exist. You kind of taking this idea that nature and the fundamental building blocks of nature are something to find meaning in and something to celebrate.
Right, to make meaning with.
Yeah. I love that. And I it's funny because we talk about the STEAM movement a lot, right? We talk about how like sci-art and science meeting the arts.
I'm not really familiar with that, so you'll have to bring me
Yeah,
up to.
so, STEM is a common acronym that we say, science, technology, engineering, math. We're always talking about getting more women involved in STEM and more minorities involved in STEM. And, I work in STEM. And, I'm a STEM communicator. And then I think in many ways it's taken on this new life as STEAM, science, technology, engineering, the arts, and math, because more and more people are starting to understand that, like, these are fundamentally creative endeavors. And if you don't have a solid science and arts education as a youth, and you don't grow up, I think, valuing what science and art and the processes behind them and the meanings that you can glean from them give you, I don't think you'll be as well-rounded an individual.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I actually, I did a talk with Jenna Levin in New York, and I was talking about this with her because she's so good at sort of, I suppose she's one of the best writers about science that there are. And so she has a talent with language. And I think that metaphor and analogy are extremely useful for both science and art. Right, it's the fundament on which both of sort of these practices rest, and I think that while science is the only way of knowing about the world, we have to have a way of talking about it as well. So I don't want to sit here and look at a painting and describe the position of its quarks and list all of their values. I think that's a ridiculous way to talk about the painting. We have to use a more granular process, right? And that's what art is. It's reflective.
I appreciate that you made the distinction with Sean between sort of like productive, maybe that's not quite the right word, but descriptive and reflective.
Yeah, so I say that science is descriptive and predictive, but that art is reflective.
And I think that's there was something about that brought comfort to me, because sometimes, as somebody who is so staunch materialist, such a staunch naturalist, and who came up through the science ranks, I sometimes struggle with artistic sensibility. I'm a little cynical about it. I'm definitely that person who like might be in a museum and be like, I don't understand, like a kid could do that. Like I struggle sometimes when I try to appreciate art.
You'd be surprised how many times you will say that and then you go try and do it. And you see if you can make a Cy Twombly.
No, for sure. And I'm definitely one of those people who has I think part of it is that I have very little personal artistic talent, like intrinsic artistic talent. And so I've always struggled with the appreciation side of it. But I think it spoke to me in a way that comforted me a little bit when you made that distinction, that it kind of like the idea of this was not for art to co-opt the place of science.
No, well, you have so many people making these trite comparisons and saying they're really the same thing. And I'm sorry, they're not, but it doesn't mean that they can't talk to each other in any way. And I'm the last person who's going to sit here and say that art should be of science or science should be of art. They shouldn't. But they can interact in ways. I mean, this is a subject that's almost untouched in the art world, possibly having to do with sort of like the ideology of the art world, and it's being so closely linked with postmodernism and continental philosophy and Lacan and Baudrillard, all these people. So, that's another sort of avenue.
I'm interested in that avenue, though. So you talk, I hear you say words like postmodernism, and I don't actually fully know what they mean.
I don't think they know what they mean either.
That makes me feel better.
The idea, coming up through art school, you would read a lot of social constructionism and postmodernist texts. Just for instance, some of the most ridiculous would be Lacan in using impenetrable prose and deliberately obfuscatory sort of self-referential or citing other postmodernist language to come up with some mathematical proof that says, in fact, the essence of masculinity is the square root of 2. And I'm sitting there scratching my head like, guys, you're swallowing this with a straight face and this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Luce Irigaray, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, but we did an exegesis once on one of her essays about general relativity and how it's a sexist equation because it privileges light over the other forces, which are somehow more fluid or...
So wait, is light masculine here?
Yes, well, that's the assertion that I like. That's the basis of this argument. I'm like, first of all, you don't understand what an equation is, right? Because all of these variables are working together. And then, secondly, how did you arrive at this?
And light, if anything, I think light is more feminine. Thank you very much.
Well, we could argue about this forever, but it's completely ridiculous.
It is. It's totally random.
Yeah. So, but I also think it's incredibly solipsistic, this idea that reality is socially constructed. Like since the Copernican revolution, everything has been pushing our position in the universe into science has been pushing us into smaller and smaller place. Right?
Yeah,
we
more
make
and
our
more
meaning. We
insignificant.
make our reasons. We make our meaning, but we are not creating the universe. And in a sense, this idea is very solipsistic because it's basically that we are creating our reality.
And to me, it's very angsty. It's a little teenage. You know, I remember going through those phases when I was reading a lot of sort of existential philosophy. Not that there's not so many important things that like Nietzsche and like Sartre like taught us, but to actually fully dive in face first to this idea of solipsism, this idea that everything I see and feel and touch is all constructed by my own mind and my reality is not defined by yours. It flies in the face of science and psychology. Like we know that there is consensus. We know, there's
right
irrefutable proof.
Well,
that,
a lot of people don't. I mean, you and I do, but a lot of people find the sort of the strictures that reality puts on us as depressing, which is weird because there are strictures of the universe that we must follow.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of possibility within that set of
so
strictures.
much so that we can't even
we
calculate
can't even get
it.
there. I know.
Yeah.
It's like this is not depressing at all because we will never arrive at a point where like, okay, this is not possible, that is not possible. It's just I don't know. I don't get that sentiment.
Yeah, it is funny when I sometimes talk to people who kind of are a little bit armchair philosophers who fancy themselves interested in science but don't necessarily, I think, value what the core of the scientific method offers us. There is this idea that somehow reality itself is too limiting, and the only way to really enjoy life or to find true meaning in life is to operate on a level that's sort of para-reality, right? That's
metaphysical. Twiddling your
metaphysical.
thumbs and say, "Isn't it all so mysterious?" I mean, that's great, but it's also not.
Yeah, it ignores what's right in front of your face. It's very grass is always greener. You know what I mean? It's very like I'm interested in living in a fantasy world in order to avoid what I have available to me, which I get in certain situations. I totally understand that mentality in children of abuse and in refugees and individuals who are dealing with very brutal realities of life. I mean, that's why I love Russian literature, because that's what it's all about, is this escape from the mundane world to something a little more fantastic. But when I see like Beverly Hills philosophers thinking that way.
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's not everyone's obligation to. Science is hard.
Yeah, of course.
learning about art is hard. Learning about anything, learning about foreign policy is hard. But no one's obliged to know these things.
No.
But the thing with culturally, the thing is, it's unique with science, I think, because people can sit there without having the vocabulary for it or without having learned it and say, well, actually, that's, I don't believe that's not true. And it's like, okay, but you don't have the expertise to say that.
I wish that we could push culture somehow, or maybe push is the wrong word, lead culture, work for a culture. I think we're all actively trying to do this in our own way, but work towards a culture in which there is an underlying bit of an obligation not to be a scientific professional, but to be a scientific thinker. And to be at least somewhat abreast of what's happening in politics, and to be somewhat abreast of what is happening in the economy, to actually be an informed voter.
Yes, I mean, that would be ideal, but I always get nervous about saying, let's push towards this or
Yeah.
that, because ultimately there's something dark about any kind of program that you could put in place to sort of, then who's deciding what, and it's ultimately a free speech argument.
Yeah,
no
that's
one's
how you
under
get to
any
Jim
obligation.
Crow. Of course, that's how you get to these like poll taxes and these horrible tests and things like that's the terrible dark side, and it's dark, but it's not in the dark. It's not in the shadows because we fucking lived it, which is so sad. Like, it's actually a core part of our history. But it's true, I think it's always a struggle in a democracy. You see the efficiencies of dictatorships. You see the ability by which dictatorships can actually get things done because it's proclaimed from on high. And there's a quote from a NoFX song that I really like, when they say, political scientists get the same one vote as some Arkansas inbred, which I know sounds terrible, but the point that he's trying to make is, or he says, there's no point for democracy when ignorance is celebrated. Political scientists get the same one vote as some Arkansas inbred. Majority rule don't work in mental institutions. And then we go on with our lives, blah, blah, blah.
Right, but the alternative is scarier.
Exactly. It's true. It's kind of the lesser, and isn't this always the compromise with government, right? And with society and policy. It's the less.
But this is also why it's so important to have sort of executive areas of government. So I don't want foreign policy being put to a vote in the United States. Why? Because you really have to know the workings of international politics to make decisions like those. So I don't think that's the sort of thing that should be put to a referenda. That's when you actually need leadership.
Yeah, can you imagine if debate with North Korea was a ballot initiative in California?
Ballot initiatives in California, that's something else.
I know, it's like the extreme terrible end of our like broken democracy here. But yeah, it's true. There's, it's always tempered. And I think lots of times we like to talk about politics or religion or any of these, or art, these things that speak to us so deeply in a non-nuanced, very black and white way. But the truth is we need democracy with representation. We need individual votes, and we need a free market with regulation. And a lot of people talk about these things in the abstract as if they could ever exist without checks and balances.
Right.
Which is crazy to me. And that's why I think that the political climate right now is so frightening, because the rhetoric that I'm hearing, especially, I mean, you know me, I'm fucking liberal. Like, it is what it is. I'm liberal. I'm not trying to hide it on my show. We don't talk about it much on SGU, but on this show, my progressive voice comes out, and what's happening on the right is so scary to me. Not to say that there aren't things happening on the left that I'm not also really upset by.
Yeah, I think there's some real schisms in both the left and right, and I think I think where we are right now, what's really scary, and this is maybe global and not just here, is that it's less about liberal versus conservative, which is maybe a useful sort of ideological framework within which to debate politics, but now it's about left and right.
Yeah.
And core values don't seem to matter anymore. Liberals have sort of left core values behind, like freedom of speech and freedom of the individual to free speech. And conservatives are really in this era, like this zone of post modern or post-truth or post-fact politics, where they just say something and the next day they'll say something else.
But you're applauded for being honest. You're applauded for being somehow you beating
telling
back
it
the
like
bullshit.
it is
Yeah.
by telling it like it's definitely not, right? I mean, everyone likes to compare Donald Trump to Berlusconi. Mm-hmm. I suppose he's kind of that, he looks like that sort of figure, but I think it's more edifying to see him as the scion of Sarah Palin, person who can just string together a completely incoherent sentence of like folksy sound bites.
But to seem like they know what they're talking about.
Right, and it actually means nothing when you diagram it. You write it down on a piece of paper. It means nothing at all.
And it's when it does have a glimmer of meaning, or it does have a glimmer of something that's at least consistent, the roots feel so incredibly dark.
Yeah.
You know,
and you've got a NATO skeptic and a Putin sympathizer running for the Republican ticket. That is an absurd sentence. Like, even as craven as I thought Mitt Romney was, I would never picture myself saying the words I just said 4 years ago.
No, it's true. And there's somebody did a supercut of his nomination speech cut against Republican nominees going back to Nixon and taking similar sentiments and just putting them side by side. Mm-hmm. And when I say similar sentiments, I mean parallel sentiments, where basically everything is more aggressive, more angry, and almost more violent coming out of Donald Trump's mouth.
Yes, it's like the same thing, just now with more steroids and perhaps some like LSD thrown in there. It's
and why was he just yelling the whole time during that speech? He was just like so mad sounding. I'm definitely interested to see how the DNC how the convention shapes up. You know, I want to see, I don't think there will be fire fought with fire completely. I think some of it'll happen. I just don't think the Democratic Party has never quite been the party of like good, like effective slogans anyway.
No. So temperamentally unfit for office it doesn't really roll off the tongue. Yeah. It's not candy on the tongue.
Yeah, so there's always been that struggle. Have you been a big Hillary supporter since the beginning, or were you more of a Bernie Sanders? No, you were more Hillary from the beginning.
I was, and unapologetically so, and I think Bernie's a great guy. He just wasn't my candidate, and I'm not a shill, and I haven't been paid, and I'm really not an establishmentarian of the Democratic Party either, because I disagree with them on so many things. Mm-hmm. I just think that to run for office of the global hegemon, you have to have a repertoire that is greater than one song. Mm-hmm. And he sings it very well, the song about inequality and sort of corporate corruption and runaway corporatism. But I didn't feel like he had the chops, foreign policy-wise, or just in a broad sense.
And we're not in an environment, we're not in a climate where you can kind of become an isolationist all of a sudden. You just can't.
No. I mean, there's no room for error right now.
Yeah.
I don't remember growing at any point in my life things being as fraught as they are now. And I'm not one of these people who's always like, I'm always skeptical of people saying, oh, things are so much worse now than they were before. But they really seem to be worse now than they were before at any point in our life.
I asked my mother the other day if she were my age and she were trying to decide, because my mom had me when she was 35. I'm 33. I'm about to be 33. And I asked her the other day, you know, if you were in my shoes, if you're, I don't plan on having children, but you just happen to live now. Would you do it all over again? Do you think you would have me? And she was like, absolutely not. She was like, I would not feel comfortable having you in this climate. So like objectively, somebody in her 60s feels the same way, you know? It was different when she had me in the 80s. It felt different. Maybe she was more naive then. Who knows? Maybe she wasn't paying it. You know, her eyes were less open. She wasn't paying attention. But my mom, I was lucky enough to have a mother who had me at 35. She was an adult when she had me. Right. She wasn't a young, naive child. So yeah, I think that we're seeing that sentiment echoed by people who are generations past us.
And people falling back into sort of reactionary views. This march or this arc towards increased liberalism is not something we should take for granted. It's something that we should fight for all the time. And that's why I see, I mean, so many of the things that are happening in the left on university campuses, et cetera, as extremely worrying and just infantile.
It is so dangerous, it seems like this lack of understanding that the political spectrum really is not approaching infinity on either side. It really is circular. And when you become so left-leaning, and I shouldn't say it's so left-leaning, but you become somehow so sensitive to ideology on the left that you start, squashing free speech, you actually become, conservative. I mean, this is where that sort of intersection is.
I don't think you become conservative. I think you become
regressively left.
I think you become maybe dogmatic, authoritarian. I mean, the left has always has had sort of its genesis has always had ties to authoritarianism as well.
But I guess that's true. I've always kind of wondered where we think of like intense communism as being a very, very left, and I'm not talking about socialism, people.
That's why I'm
talking about communism.
I always think it's useful. I mean, maybe it's silly just to talk about left, right? I always think it's useful to talk about what liberalism is and what conservatism is.
Yeah, because otherwise you do start to get into this fuzzy area that really can't be defined on either side of the spectrum. Fascism, for example. Is fascism far right, or is it just in between?
But the left and the right used to be more closely tethered to liberalism and conservatism than perhaps they are now. And maybe that's what's so strange about this time that we're living in.
Yeah, I feel like maybe I should actually start using the term liberal more often, because I find myself, maybe it's the same way that a lot of atheists will shy away from the label atheism, which I don't, but I see people saying, "Oh, I'm a humanist, I'm a bright." They'll come up with all these euphemisms because they're afraid that atheism has such a negative connotation. I find myself saying I'm progressive. I don't say liberal anymore. I think it's because I'm afraid of what people think of when they think the word liberal.
Well, that's why I don't call myself a progressive, because then I think that people will think that I'm sort of a foreign policy isolationist, Bernie Sanders supporter, or there's a whole bunch of baggage that comes.
Or like you want trigger warnings on everything.
Trigger warnings, exactly. Yeah.
And that's probably for me.
You should have warned me that you were going to say that word, because I'm very offended by it.
I've gotten multiple tweets about trigger warnings that just. It's funny because I'm not one of these people who's made it my platform. Like my friend Dave Rubin, it's his platform to now he is a full on kind of, we need to stop the regressive left. This is what he talks about all the time. He's always having Sam Harris on his podcast and another good friend Faisal Muhtar on his podcast talking about these things. It's not my platform. It matters to me, but I have other things on my mind and science. But the thing that worries me most about it is the how much it sort of starts to tear at the fabric of the First Amendment, of the core of our Constitution, free speech and freedom to not honor any religion above the other. I mean, these are the two things that were so important that they were written down first.
Protecting the person whose views are the most disgusting to you.
Yes, you have to. Because the minute that you can say, oh, because you think that way, I can police you, all of a sudden,
right? That's the who decides problem, and I'm not a big fan of slippery slope arguments, but this is a great one.
It's the definition of a slippery slope.
Whenever I have this argument with people at a dinner table, I always look around. It's usually a dinner table of friends, who trust each other and have a high opinion of each other's intellect. And I say, who at this table would you let not only decide what you can say for the rest of your life, but also what you can hear for the rest of your life? And everyone, even though they're sitting around a table with people they love, everyone's like, I'm not letting anyone here tell me what to say and think or hear.
And I think that's why we see people, I see Dave, and he gets a lot of flack for it, giving a platform or working really hard to almost befriend, in a way, this Milo guy at Nero, because I know he's horribly racist and he's disgusting and he's everything, but I think the whole point...
He is a minor intellect.
Yeah.
He's a, forgive me, he's like a shit with lipstick on. I think he is kind of like this sort of a Donald Trump sort of figure. He says things to be outrageous.
I don't think he believes any of them. I think
maybe he does. I don't really care.
I think he fundamentally does it to get liberals to try to silence him so that he can prove his point.
I follow a lot of people on Twitter I don't agree with. By following him, I actually tweeted at him last week I said, I'm sorry I'm unfollowing you. I'm sure you love to think that it's because of controversy, but actually you're just criminally boring. Because it's all a bunch of self-congratulations, just like Trump. It's like, so-and-so banned me, blah, blah, blah. Well, now he's off of Twitter anyway. But,
he got fully banned.
No, I think...
And hate speech that's like it's not interesting hate speech. It's like bottom of the barrel.
No, it's like, let me be outrageous.
Yeah. It's Ann Coulter incarnate. You know, that's really what it is.
There are no lesbians, that lesbians don't exist.
Really? He says that? That's sad for him.
Something like that.
What a boring world. No lesbians.
I like lesbians.
I like lesbians too. But yeah, it's not we had Ann Coulter. It's like we know what this is like. We know the purpose of it, the core of the motivation. And he's not even doing it right because he hasn't written a bunch of books and made a lot of money. You know what I mean? Like it could be a platform for that. But regardless, I see why Dave chooses to fall on that sword, because I think that the point that's being made there is that even a piece of shit like this person, who is in many ways not even worth our efforts, see how hard people work to silence him. That is actually more dangerous than the rhetoric that he's spewing.
Absolutely. And we should hear him, and we should let him speak. I mean, I saw it's funny because I'm interested in these issues. YouTube's algorithm always seems to think that I'm a conservative or like a Trump supporter, so it always pushes all of these sort of like alt-right videos on me, and which I'm not aligned with in any way. Let's just be clear about that.
But it's important to know your enemy,
right? So I'm interested to watch what the arguments are on the other side. Someone who's not familiar with the arguments opposed to their own is not doing a good job of thinking, right?
Which, by the way, sorry to interject, is so frustrating about Trump, because I don't know what his arguments are, because he doesn't seem to have any policies.
Right. Well, we'll get back to that.
Yeah.
But, so I saw this video of Black Lives Matter supporters getting up on stage and shutting down a Milo talk at a university, and it was so embarrassingly stupid. Because if you've got an argument, then say it, but don't just get up on stage and parade around and shut down a talk. There are other people there who took their time to go listen. You want to protest, it's fine. But
like the same thing happened here at UCLA when Milo went to talk, and there was like a feminist group that basically was like spitting at him and throwing things at him.
It's just ideologically incoherent. So you have a protest and you execute it, but shutting down discussion, no matter how ugly it is, I don't think is really useful.
And it's especially depressing when you see it coming from core social movements that so absolutely matter. You know, feminist movements matter. The Black Lives Matter movement matters because this is a real problem in our country right now that you cannot avoid. And it's so important that voices that historically have not been heard are heard. And the quickest way to silence your own voice is to try to silence others. It just delegitimizes you, and it's a bummer. And I'm hoping...
But the fact that we're talking about this in 2016 is ridiculous to me. And this is one of those reminders. Like, people forget that the foundations that our democracy are built upon are not guaranteed.
That's true.
And these facile sort of arguments about hate speech and this, and we have to protect people from being offended. I mean, no, that's part of what comes with this structure of governance.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say earlier, I got a tweet recently where it was some sort of... I like to tweet a lot of science stories all week throughout the week to keep people informed. I look through my feed reader. I find what's really interesting that week, and I try and, push out those stories. And one of them was about some sort of new blood test for something. It was some interesting, biomedical tech that's happening. And the picture that I chose, because there's always a picture. I think it's, you want your social media to be visual, was a finger prick. A little drop of blood on a fingertip, because it's like this new blood test. And I got a tweet from somebody saying that should have had a trigger warning. And they have a very intense reaction to the sight of blood, and that I should have been more sensitive to my viewership. And I
hope they don't turn on the TV.
I about lost my mind. I was like, I don't know how to respond to this person in a way that doesn't sound so harsh. So I don't remember if I even responded. I
mean, I'm one of those people who will force myself to watch something I really don't want to watch, like children dying of chemical weapons in Syria, for instance, so that I can empathize and see what's actually happening, even though it makes me sick to my stomach.
You have to, though. You cannot ignore all the bad and just fill your head with cotton candy.
Don't forget unicorns.
And unicorns in Ecuador. I think wasn't that the James Randi quote? It's like talking about how you can't disprove a negative, or you can't prove a negative. Like, I can't prove there are no unicorns in Ecuador. It's true. There could be, but there probably aren't. Yeah, it's interesting to see these times when individuals, even people you know personally, who are aligned with you on so many intellectual topics, have these big, they're so divergent on other things.
Blind spots.
But
I wouldn't. I mean,
sacred cows.
It sounds awful to put it that way because I'm not suggesting that the way you or I think is the right way to think on all subjects. I wouldn't want to be sitting in a group of aligned friends.
No, but so maybe I should say
boring.
diverge from like the skeptical consensus, or diverge from not even the consensus, but there are things that are always being argued among the upper echelon of experts, right? We don't know if string theory is real. It's interesting to talk about string theory. It's interesting to talk about the multiverse, and that's not settled. And so seeing somebody argue about whether or not the multiverse exists is fascinating. Mm-hmm. But arguing about things that are settled, arguing about whether or not the earth is flat, arguing about whether or not genetically modified organisms cause cancer, these are the things that get so frustrating.
That's a big liberal blind spot.
Huge liberal blind spot. And it's such a bummer because we take flack for it, individuals who are considered to be, liberals and really aligned with the party, and say like, oh, I disagree with you on that. Sorry. Mm-hmm. That's why I can't be green. There's so many things about the Green Party that I really respect, but they're so fucking anti-science. Mm-hmm. They're like the party of holistic doctors.
I actually know nothing about them. I probably should.
And there's a lot of anti-vax rhetoric.
Yeah.
But that's specific to America, I'm learning, because I've gotten a lot of tweets when we have...
You mean anti-vax, but certainly not anti-GMO.
No, anti-vax, the American Green Party is specifically anti-vax, but the Green Party, and specifically like anti-big pharma and kind of like pro alternative medicine, you don't see it as much in other countries. Mm-hmm. Their versions of the Green Party. Right. But yeah, the anti-GMO thing is fucking everywhere. Yeah, it's in almost every developed country. That's a bummer. Do you have a lot of friends who are like super libby who are anti-GMO?
I don't know.
Yeah. You don't talk about that one much.
It's not really something that comes up very often.
Really? It comes up all the time for me. It
comes up with strangers if I'm like itching for an argument at a party or something.
You have an interesting cross-section of friends because there are definitely people from all walks of life when I attend your parties. Really educated, really interesting, and sometimes quite privileged individuals because you live on the west side of LA. You know what I mean? That's where there's money and there's wealth, and there are networks from academics that are more privileged networks. I see it too with my friends at Caltech. Mm-hmm. It ain't cheap. It ain't easy to get into Caltech, and so, but also, diversity as well. But it does make me wonder sometimes how common it is. I would love the answer to this question. Are you a native Angelino?
I am.
Native Angelinos fascinate me.
I've actually been challenged at a party before, being like, "Well, where were you born? What hospital? What floor?" It's like
because they don't.
So
believe
many
you.
people don't believe you when you say that. Yeah, because everyone here sort of moves from elsewhere.
Yeah, and the people who did grow up here kind of all seem to know each other, which is kind of weird.
That's true, but
I don't know. A lot of you go to the same school. Did you go to...
I went to Merman, and then first I went to the Center for Early Education, then Merman, then Harvard-Westlake.
I know a lot of people that were at Harvard-Westlake.
That or Brentwood is typical sort of trajectory of
high achieving kind of academic. Yeah. And so I'm interested to see, because this is such a cool but weird and fascinating bubble to grow up in, right? How often do you encounter people who actually believe in God and or are actually members of an organized religion here? Because I take for granted in LA that just everyone's atheist.
It's a good question. I'm trying to think now. And I can't place anyone except there's someone that's a mutual friend of ours. But
who's Christian, but that's it. Yeah. And even then, not like not the way
No,
that...
I couldn't. I know people who believe in belief.
Yeah.
I know people who like to say that they're spiritual and they just won't admit to a naturalistic perspective on the universe. Maybe they feel drawn towards it, but they just can't get there. They can't say that there's one thing and magic isn't it.
Yeah.
But I know people like that, but I don't know anyone who's really observant.
That's much more common here. I would actually venture to guess, or maybe it's just in my social circles, that there are more practitioners of like woo religion
in LA, sure, yeah,
than of actual religion. Like there are more people here who kind of believe in the church of like colonics and chiropractic than God. It's so weird. Do you know a lot of people who are into like super wooey bullshit like crystals and colonics?
No, because I would definitely argue them out of that. But there's a lot of like cleanse people. Cleansing is a very LA thing.
It's very LA
where
to
you
have a juice cleanse. Yeah,
starve yourself by choice and drink juice with no fiber in it. That's just sugar.
It's like lemon and cayenne. For some reason, if you put cayenne in, it's really healthy. Yeah.
But LA is a unique place for that sort of industry.
And that's what you grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
Is it?
But also there were really nice things about that. I mean, growing up in LA, there used to be this place called Mrs. Gooch's, which turned into Whole Foods. And it was like one of these first concepts of like, let's have a store that's really about, they do some things that aren't really about health, like homeopathy or whatever. But let's have a store that's kind of focused around sort
not
of
organics
and health and not junk food and,
It's true. If you're in LA, you can have any dietary restriction under the sun. If you actually have celiacs, you can find food that doesn't have gluten. If you are, horribly lactose intolerant, you can find food that has no lactose. Veg, vegan, anything, you can eat really well in LA. Actually, the hardest way to eat in LA, I think, is being like a through and through Texan, like a meat and potatoes Texan. But I find my way. So
that's how I cook anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Oh my God.
I'm a carnivore.
The best steak I think I've ever had was at your house with those mushroomy things on top. And I don't even like mushrooms.
Yes.
Do you remember with the crunchy
dehydrated mushroom chips?
So you guys, Landon brought me ice cream today that he made at home by hand. That's Applewood smoked caramel ice cream.
Mm-hmm.
So it tastes like a campfire, like a salty, smoky, sweet campfire. It's like the greatest thing ever.
Smoke is one of my favorite flavors. I think it should be, you know how you have those, what are the 4 categories of taste?
Oh, yeah.
I think it should be like the 5th.
Yeah, like sour, sweet,
bitter,
spicy, bitter, whatever. Yeah, umami.
Salty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, salty, you're right. Bitter,
and umami. So yes, there should be a 6 and it should be smoky.
Yeah, there's not enough smoke. Well, that's after my own heart as a Texan. I love all meat smoked.
Yeah.
Smoke a meat, I'm going to eat it. It's so, and then smoked desserts now. Actually, Tegan, she was in the living room when you first brought it by. Tegan's been on the show before, if you guys remember. She's been on twice, actually. And she took a bite. She's vegetarian. And she was like, is there meat in this ice cream?
Yeah, because some people think it's bacon ice cream.
Yeah, and you're like, no, it's just smoke. Oh my God, so good. What got you to start cooking? You're such a creative chef at home. Is that the art?
No, I think that's the interest in science.
Really?
And actually, I'm sure you've heard this story before. It's not an exaggeration. When I was very young, like 11 or 12, I would make high explosives, meaning nitroglycerin and TNT, RDX. I should not be admitting this on the radio. But I was a kid, and I was super interested in the science of like high energetic materials and how something in such a small form could cause such destruction based on the instability of its molecular structure. I thought that was fascinating. Then it all went very bad one day, no matter how meticulous or careful you are. This is the do not do this at home warning. And I blew up the kitchen and almost died.
Oh my God, what did your parents do?
I'm not getting into that. But like it was something out of a movie. I flew across the room. There was stone could have cut me in half, but it just missed me. Like it was very bad. So I stopped on that day, and I dabbled in making psychedelics when I was 15 or 16, and then I stopped doing that, and I just started cooking, and it's really the same thing. I mean, I love experimenting in the kitchen. So I'm into all of this sort of modernist cuisine, like sous vide and pressure rendering and all of that sort of Harold McGee.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Nathan Myhrvold stuff. So,
Like the what do they call it? Molecular gastronomy stuff.
yeah,
Do you
I'm not
use,
like super advanced. I'm not like
liquid nitrogen and all-
gelatinating
yeah.
spheres and all of that. But I do find it really. I just it's like a cathartic. It's how I relax.
Interesting. I've always been the opposite. I've always found that cooking is stressful and frustrating for me. I like to bake. Baking is very relaxing,
Baking
and to
I
me,
can't do.
baking. It's so funny because to me, baking is more like science. But
It's
I
rote.
understand what you mean about cooking being like
Cooking
science.
is like experimenting. I think baking is more rote. I mean, if you're a very advanced pastry chef or whatever,
Sure,
you're inventing new
sure.
stuff, but you really have to follow that
You do, and
recipe. And I hate following recipes.
And when you work as a lab scientist for a long time at the bench, you realize how much of your work is that rote repetition. It's perfectly titrating. It's perfectly balancing. It's the lab tech stuff. It's the follow the recipe to a T to get the exact right, chemical compound that you need for X, Y, and Z. And so for me, baking has always been really fun because if I do everything just precisely, it turns out perfect every time.
Right.
And then you can change one tiny little variable and adjust it. And the next time you'll see if it's that much better. Whereas cooking is like just, I don't know, it's just so stressful to me. It's like so many variables, so many things can go wrong. It always ends up burnt or too dry or too chewy. It's just, I don't have that finesse.
You have to have like a basis of practice to then riff off of. You can't, I mean, you need a few like fundamentals, and you need confidence, and you need the pan to be searing hot, and you need to salt it enough, and you need to season it enough, and not be afraid, and not be like changing the temperature. Oh, is that too hot? I should turn it down. Oh, I should turn it back up. That's where you screw up.
Yeah.
But once you have that, then you can sort of like, it's like, you know how to play the piano, and now you can be a jazz pianist. Like you can kind of experiment with it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I've learned as I've gotten older and I've gotten more established. I feel like this is what your 30s are for, right? Your teens are for like totally fucking up and figuring out like how not to kill yourself. Your 20s are for fucking up less and figuring out how not to lose your fucking mind after a breakup and how not to blow all of your money, on things that you shouldn't be buying. And then in your 30s, you start to sort of understand where to put your energy, like what makes me happy and what feels wasteful. And you start to calibrate, what is my worth? How much am I personally worth per hour, right? And like, do I want to spend my time scrubbing toilets, or do I want to and everybody has those little things where they're like, I'd rather pay somebody to do it because it's not worth my investment. And then other things where they're like, I would never pay somebody to do that because they can't do it the way I like to. Right. And I'm like that for laundry. I don't like it when my lovely and brilliant and amazing housekeeper, Lucy, does my laundry. She only does the bedding on my bed, and she makes my bed look amazing. But like, I don't like people touching my clothes. I want to do my clothes. I don't cook. I just don't enjoy it. It's just not a place
totally
I like to put my energies. You know
a
what I mean?
lot of people don't like it, and it's too much work.
And then I know people who are like, make tons of money and are really established, and then they'll like clean their own house. Like they'll put a lot of elbow grease in, and then I'm like, why don't you just like pay somebody to do that? And they're like, I don't like to.
It's enjoyable.
Yeah, it's enjoyable. I really like you can probably fucking tell in my house I'm neurotic about this. I like organizing things.
So you can't see, guys, but Cara's house is like the most immaculate museum. It looks like the Tate or something in here. You can't find anything because the cabinets are so clean. They don't have like
handles.
There's no indication of what's in them. It's just like walls of cabinets. Everything. It's like a gallery.
Yeah, it's true. Our favorite game is like find the trash can in the kitchen.
Yes.
But I do. I'm like neurotic about everything being just so. And for me, that's my zen. You know what I mean? Like you're in the kitchen. I'm organizing books by genre and height.
I'm interested if there's any good like science about this, because I've always been like sort of vibrated to this idea of psychogeography, like the way that things are laid out in this room around me is affecting my mood.
Oh, completely.
And I cannot work in this in a pigsty or when things are clean. I seem to be able to think better, and I'm wondering if that's a real thing or not.
I bet you it is. I mean, I think aesthetics is fundamentally important to most people's processes. I think we we use it as an excuse for procrastination a lot. You know, oh, that thing isn't organized, or there's too much in my inbox, so I can't write that paper yet. But there is something to be said about everything around you feeling done allows you to become more creative. It's almost like your creativity is imprisoned by process. And once you can cross things off your list and clear that process, then you're unencumbered.
Yeah.
You know, and
I think it's
important.
also visually distracting. Or
Yeah, it is.
It might be something in the way that, like, if you are, in fact, neurologically responding to a piece of art in a museum that you're looking at, it's affecting your mood, then likewise, looking at a pile of garbage around you or your clothes strewn everywhere can affect your mood.
And some people, and I don't think that it's unilateral in that way, because there are definitely studies, these studies do exist, that try to look for correlates of personality traits. So like probably the biggest, most accepted way to measure personality is the big 5 traits, OCEAN, which I can never remember what they are. It's like openness to experience versus the opposite, conscientiousness versus the opposite, extroversion versus introversion, agreeableness versus the opposite, and then neuroticism. So like I
think I'm the former on every one except for the 4th.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm very agreeable.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know where I fall on that.
I don't know if I want to be agreeable.
I'm highly conscientious, and I'm highly neurotic. Like these are things that are like hallmarks of who I am, and I'm also a big introvert. And they found which seems weird because I'm
I don't see
on public, but it's, if you notice, follow me around at parties. Like the next time we're at a party together, you'll see I can only really talk to 1 or 2 people. I'm definitely not life of the party, center of the group. Like I'm off on my own. It's easy to be on TV as an introvert because you actually are only talking to the camera, you know? But I do have days where I'll come home from work and I'll be exhausted, and my boyfriend will so sweetly like put his arms around me. He'll start giving me a lot of attention, and I'll be like, I don't think I can handle the attention right now because it's too much after being surrounded by people at work. But there are really interesting studies that introverts and extroverts, there are at least correlates with brain activity and really kind of threshold of perceptual information, or I should say sensational information. So basically, they found that individuals who score higher on extroversion measures need more input. Like they need more visual and auditory input in order to feel like they're at a baseline. Whereas individuals that score high on introversion measures, the more visual and auditory input they get, the more anxiety inducing it is. So it's crazy to me. My boyfriend can work. He can physically write on his laptop while he is listening to music with lyrics.
Yeah, I can't do that.
To me, that's like the craziest skill set anybody could have. It's hard.
Yeah, I can't do that.
And maybe that's why certain individuals need a lot of cleanliness and a lot of order in their space, because the visual noise becomes so overwhelming to them, they physically can't focus on the task at hand. Whereas other people actually need an overwhelming visual space.
That's interesting. I think there's something to get a purchase on there.
Yeah, otherwise they actually feel like they're below threshold, and they're like, oh, I'm stressed by the quiet in this room. I notice that some people, when they come to my house, which is very modern, you called it a museum. I mean, it's very white. Everything's white. Some people are like, oh, I love it. It's so relaxing. And other people are like, how the fuck do you live like this? It's so cold. You know, and there's something to be said about personal taste and aesthetics, which to me is always the frustrating part. Coming round full circle, I think the frustrating part of art is that I'm bad at things that don't have objective truths, you know, and art seems to lack a core truth.
Emergent a phenomenon. Yes, but you don't need to be drawing some bright line, right? There's a spectrum here. There's work that's conceptual, that is about concrete things. There's work that's less about concrete things, that maybe is gestural. I don't know that you need to be drawing lines about what's this about necessarily. But I do think that there's such a thing as bad art and good art.
And how do you define that?
I don't know, but I know it when I see it.
Sean said the same thing. Sean said something very similar at your talk when he was saying that you could take we could do a scientific experiment. 50% of the people are art critics and artistically educated. 50% of the people are like me, who are like, my kid could do that. I don't know anything. And then send them to a gallery where 50% of the art on the wall is like outsider, like, not anything by anybody trained, and 50% is by the best names in art. And probably the majority of people would still pick the high art as being the high art.
I think that's right.
Yeah. There's just something in it that we would know, oh, that's good.
Well, a lot of times you can tell craftsmanship, materials, no matter how messy maybe the paint on the canvas is, that it's done well and that it took a lot of care to do.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely right.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to explain. I think, again, this is a very sort of explaining art is like explaining consciousness. It's not easy. It's an emergent thing. It's a very, very, and like all of the other sort of high level emergent things, it's very important to us.
And
it's also the hardest to explain.
Because it's so in many ways intuitive. That doesn't mean it's not real. Like, intuition is not so abstract that it doesn't exist. Intuition is a real phenomenon.
Right.
Intuition occurs because of historical understanding. Intuition is this emergent thing that we have based on so much
metaphor.
information.
Metaphor, I think, affects intuition as well as scientific intuition. I actually asked Sean about this when we did that talk, because I feel like there's, to a certain extent, when you're looking at a piece at a Rothko, say in a museum, you've got, and I think they've actually done studies about this, where fMRI studies where multiple regions of your brain are lighting up at the same time: color, spatial, maybe olfactory. I don't know.
Emotional,
there's a type of sort of overconnectivity, or like a pseudo synesthesia, or perhaps a real synesthesia going on. That to me is pretty much the same thing as metaphor. I mean, if I say this wine is flat, you don't think that I meant I spilled it on the table and it's actually flat.
Yeah.
You don't have to learn that. It works whether you're Chinese or French.
It works whether you're like me. I don't drink wine, but I can still envision what it means for wine to be flat.
So, I mean, V.S. Ramachandran at the Salk Institute has done work on metaphor and synesthesia. Synesthesia happens to be 8 times more common in poets, artists, and scientists, I believe.
I'm not surprised.
Like Feynman was a synesthete. But it makes sense if you think about it, because to me, metaphor is a type of compression. It's the way to say so much about something by saying exactly what it isn't, right? Just literally saying what it isn't. So Shakespeare says Juliet is the sun. She's not the sun, but he's told you so many things about what she is with those few words. And so I think, just to get back to this, like, bidirectionality of intuition and how metaphor affects it, both scientifically and artistically, I think that knowing where to go, say if you're a scientist with the math and you sort of resolve at some point on the surface area of the event horizon of a black hole, you're already metaphorizing, because you've already got words for what you're describing. A black hole is not black, and it's not a hole. And you have to sort of look at this equation and say, what does this mean? What is it like? Then you understand it in a way, perhaps, to go back to the math and say, well, maybe it's like, maybe I should go in this direction. Maybe I should go in that direction. There's some sort of intuition that comes with granulating it to an understandable language, a human language.
And that's why I have no doubt in my mind that Sean Carroll, the physicist, has a depth of understanding of his math that's beyond what some physicists might have who are less capable of explaining it to a lay audience. Because it's very difficult to really know something until you can describe it, oftentimes using metaphor. It's very difficult to know something.
Do you think that's true? I mean,
I
you think
so.
that perhaps, I mean, like, I always hear that Ed Whitten is the smartest guy in the room all the time.
Uh-huh.
But I don't see him being a science communicator. I don't see him really explaining things in that way. I wouldn't go so far as to doubt his understanding of what he's talking
I
about.
wouldn't doubt his understanding of what he's talking about, but I do think that and it may come down to how we define intelligence and how we define true knowledge, like how we define our understanding of truth. Because some might argue that intelligence fundamentally requires breadth. And that there are some people who maybe are a bit on the spectrum, not saying this about him, but there are some people who are maybe a bit on the spectrum who know more about this one focused thing than anybody else in the world. But it doesn't really, it's hard to objectively say that truth and that knowledge exists if it can't get outside of their heads.
When we're talking about metaphor, because the other thing I heard Ramachandran say is that the one group that is not capable of metaphor are autistic, heavily autistic people.
And that's the
problem.
problem.
Get a grip on yourself and they will actually grab themselves. Yes. But they excel so often at feats of memory and calculation and all these rote things that don't necessarily involve metaphor.
And so when we talk about savant syndrome, for example, somebody knowing so intimately and having pure knowledge about something very focused, it doesn't matter as much how core their knowledge is if it can't then be shared and collaborated upon, because the buck stops there, unfortunately.
Right, but that's what the group is for. Then they discover something and then we all get
exactly. And so I think that, a simple truth that I learned early on in my academic career when I started teaching was that I didn't really fucking know anything until I could teach it. I really thought I knew something. And then when I learned how to teach it to others, I realized that I started to look underneath all the stones that were unturned and go, oh, well, I thought I really got that pathway, but I was only looking at it this one way. This student is having a hard time grasping it that one way. So now that I kind of enter it from the back door or from the side, or I use this metaphor to help them understand it, I know it 3 times better in an effort to help them understand it at the
and
fundamental
you do know
way.
It. You get value. So when you use a metaphor to describe, say, what an equation is telling you, you are always losing accuracy. Right? You're always losing accuracy because you're granulating a finer grained sort of theory, but you gain value. You gain value because you really sort of feel what you're talking about.
And you can start to take that equation, that description, that whatever, that solution that you came up with, and now that you can see it as metaphor, you can rotate it in your mind. You can enter it from different ways. You can approach it differently, and you can say, wait, where does the metaphor break down? Fuck, it breaks down here. Maybe there's a core problem with the actual solution there. Or maybe that's where the metaphor breaks down and we have to continue it with a new metaphor. Brian Greene was brilliant about this when I interviewed him many years ago, and we were talking about the holographic principle and about the multiverse, and he was talking about this metaphor that he quite often uses. He tells a story of being a kid in a bathroom where there's a mirror in front and a mirror in back, and every time he looked in the mirror he could see more iterations of himself and never ending. And he was saying that this really inspired a lot of his views about the holographic principle. And he was like, of course the metaphor is not perfect. Of course, it doesn't actually continue to tell the story. And when I stopped him and I asked him, and I said, one question I love to ask theoretical physicists is, when we think about 4 dimensions, can you see in multiple dimensions the way that I can't? Is that why you can do your math better than I ever could? And none of them say they can.
No.
They all need metaphor.
We have no way. We have no way to do that.
They do not have powers of perception that you and I, as mere mortals who haven't taken the time to learn the language of math, don't have.
No, when I found that out, that actually put me at ease. I was like, oh, I'm so stupid. I can't imagine the way that this is like 11-dimensional string theory, and I couldn't picture it. And then when I realized that nobody else could either, that's
it makes
just
you
what
feel
the math
better.
said.
Yeah, it makes you feel better. And then it makes me wonder, does the person who can put it into a beautiful metaphor to help all of us understand it to some extent, really know it better than the person who just can't communicate it beyond their own understanding?
Well, it's also a talent for putting things into metaphor. Like,
that's
some
true.
people are so good at it. I mean, Richard Dawkins is one. So you get these scientists who are extremely literary and can, turn a phrase beautifully. And that's a talent that I think is maybe separate.
But it's a talent that I think we shouldn't we shouldn't ignore to the extent that we do. It's very rare. I'm not sure if it's changed now, but I know when I was going into science, we would talk about this, how rare it was that there would even be, that you would have to take the writing portion on the GRE, that you would have to submit an essay to your department, when it's like so fundamental to the scientific process that you have to fucking write up your work.
Right.
And yet somehow the skill of being able to write was not really prioritized in the scientific community.
I think people are built differently. I mean, the science will work whether you can write it well or not. And
you just got to hope for a collaborator that knows how to write.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's this thing of obliging people to be one way or another.
That's true.
I think that I like it when I can understand what you're talking about as a scientist.
Yeah, it's a bit necessary.
If that's not how you're built and you don't want to spend the time doing that, that's your decision.
And then I think it always does come down to that interesting question of what really is intelligence. Is intelligence knowing the most about something so narrow? Or is intelligence having a wide breadth but maybe never getting to those depths? Or are those just two different ways to be?
It's not one thing. I mean, it's not one thing.
And psychologists have been chasing that G factor for a very long time.
Right.
And it's true. That's why intelligence is such a fluid question, and that's
it's misguided to look at it that way, to look for one definition, just like I think it's misguided to look for the neural correlates of consciousness, because it's also not one thing. And what free will, like your free will, is not the same as mine. It's a different conception, so people sort of attach themselves to these definitions, and that's where you come into problems.
It is. It's where we stumble, but I think in many ways it's also the beginning of the exploration. I think, talking about those things and challenging what our definitions of them are. Talking about free will can start to get really frustrating if you're a neuroscientist and you're like, I'm fucking sick of having arguments with philosophers about free will. But the truth of the matter is they're absolutely necessary to further knowledge in both fields. Mm-hmm. And when I say both fields, in a combined way, because I think it is necessary we should endeavor to explore things that frustrate us, and things that maybe sometimes we think are settled, which aren't.
Right, but they can also bog you down. I mean, we don't talk about like élan vital anymore.
No.
Free will could be one of those things that maybe we should do away with using that word. I mean, talk about volition or
maybe
degrees of freedom or
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of things, and not stick to this, because it's a word like spirituality with a lot of baggage.
It's true. And sometimes when you start to have that conversation, you find on a panel about free will that these people are talking about something completely different than these people.
Or they're just agreeing, but they're
using different words. Exactly. Yeah, that's always really frustrating too. So Landon, we've been going really long. Before we finish, I want to know is there anything we didn't get to that you wanted to?
Probably a million things, but we can do it again.
Yeah, that just means we'll have to do it again. Great. And before I ask you, once again, to let people know where the show is and how they can reach you, I'm going to bother you with the final two questions, which I ask everybody who comes on the show. Big picture. Here we go. The first one is that in whatever context that is important to you, whether it's personal or global or, anything in between, what is the thing, if you could point to one thing, that concerns you the most when looking to the future, that keeps you up at night, that really is a big block for you?
I think we touched on it before, is taking the foundations of liberal democracy for granted.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think... was that my...
was your outro music, wasn't it?
This speech is too long. Get off the stage.
Nobody's going to hear that, by the way, but my closing music started to play because I just had it keyed in right then.
But then also, I mean, I think it's really important that people do not subscribe to a sort of solipsistic or like social constructionist view of reality, because in those cases it's very hard to argue for structuring things a different way, because everyone's truth is their own truth, and I think that's really problematic. And I think we've got postmodern politics and we've got postmodern journalism and we've got all of this. I think that's like really symptomatic. This idea that you can have your own truth, your own reality, is poetic in certain sort of regimes. That's fine. You can have your own subjective experience, your own intuitions, your own imaginations, reality in that sense. But there is a basis that we all have to sort of admit to.
We live in society.
Yes.
We're not hermits in the bell tower.
Right.
And we have to have a functional government. There's a point where we have to walk away from being ideologues and realize that pragmatism matters.
Yes. I mean, it's like, and if you get into this type of thinking, you what are you going to say when, Erdogan is saying, we didn't kill any Armenians? Mm-hmm. I mean, where are you going to go back to say there are facts in the world?
Yeah.
And what is the other question?
The other one is the flip side of that, which is, what is the thing that you're most optimistic about? What do you look forward to the most?
I really look forward to the future. I think I am an optimist, and I think that even though, as we just said, I think this is a very fraught time, and there are these like periodic upheavals every 50 or 60 years, according to some, I think that things are getting better, and they always will.
What is it about the future that makes you think that?
It's really a matter of sort of historicity and looking at how things have come along so far.
Literacy, technology.
It's not by any means guaranteed, mm-hmm. right? It's not like some teleology, but it just seems to be the case that things are getting better. Technologically speaking, scientifically speaking, we may be screwing up the planet, but we're also the only species that knows we're doing it and seems to care somewhat about fixing it.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. A lot of people talk about, maybe we're backsliding into a new dark age, or, these people that are very gloom and doom, but I just don't see how that's possible with all of humankind's knowledge.
We have to consider that it could be possible.
It could be, but
it does seem far-fetched.
It would be impossible to burn the Library of Alexandria now. You know what I mean? We're so fragmented, and knowledge exists in so many cubbies of the universe. We're so globally connected. Yeah, maybe if there was a horrible solar flare, you know what I mean, and we lost the internet, we would be fucked. But knowledge itself has tentacled out in a way that just hadn't happened yet, I think, historically.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful that we'll just continue to learn and stop fucking just perpetually replaying history. That we'll utilize the building blocks of our successors and predecessors. And we will we'll actually grow from there.
I think that that's likely to happen.
We just can't get too comfortable
with some upheavals in the
meantime. Yeah. And the upheavals are necessary. I mean, that's progress, right? Sometimes you got to break an egg to make an omelet. I say the most trite thing possible to mean what I'm trying to say. Well, Landon, this was so much fun. It's true. Like I will have to have you back because I would love to get deeper into some atheist philosophy with you. That's always fun.
Love it. Yeah, sure.
That's a big core of a lot of our conversations. But before we go, let everybody know again about where the show is.
The show is up at LAX Art, which is 7000 Santa Monica Boulevard. It will be up until, I think the official closing date is August the 20th. But then after a 2-week vacation that the gallery takes, I'm going to do some closing programming, which I'll put on Twitter or something, or on my Instagram, and let people know. Is there
like a website for the installation? Like, is there a place where people can read about it online?
There is a blurb, yes, on laxart.org.
Cool. So you can visit the galleries page, and also you can say hi to Landon on Twitter.
It's just my name, LandonRoss.com.
Well, that's easy.
Not .com.
Not .com.
At Landon
At Landon Ross on Twitter. Go there. You're most active on Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah.
For
totally different reasons. Like Instagram, I love as like my little diary, and Twitter, I like to complain about foreign policy mostly. It's not even about science or art. It's like super compartmentalized social media presence.
It really is, though. I think social media is good at that. Like different avenues are good for different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you want to hear Landon complain about foreign policy, you can visit him at Landon Ross, or if you want to see all of his beautiful pictures. And he gave us lots of teases about this gallery show on Snapchat, didn't you?
That's right, but my Snapchat is just for me, so it's not public. You
Gotcha.
cannot watch it.
Ha ha. But you'll be able to see some of his beautiful art and some of his more artistic dealings on Instagram as well.
Correct.
So guys, reach out, say hi to Landon. Landon, thank you so much for joining me. This was so much fun.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a blast.
It was great. And everybody out there, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.